I discovered that my husband and my daughter-in-law, an attorney, were plotting to destroy me. What they didn't know was that a retired teacher like me still has plenty left to teach. My name is Linda Walker. I'm 64 years old, and for 35 years, I believed I was living in a happy marriage. As a retired high school English teacher, I've always been careful, organized, and gentle. Maybe that's why I was too slow to notice what had been unfolding right before my eyes. It was a regular Thursday morning in March, in a small town in Oregon, when I decided to stop by my son Paul's house to bring some freshly baked apple pie for my granddaughter Sophie, who had just turned 6. That familiar road always made me smile, just a 15-minute drive through rows of maple trees shedding their leaves, and I'd always feel at peace. But that morning, when I turned onto the street where Paul lived with his wife Susan, my heart froze. My husband Richard's silver Ford Explorer was parked right in their driveway, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. But it wasn't ordinary at all. Just that morning, Richard had told me he'd be busy all day at his small auto shop downtown, working for a demanding client. I parked a few feet away and sat still in my car, a chill running down my spine, that quiet intuition every woman learns never to ignore. Something was wrong. I walked slowly toward the house, careful not to let my shoes crunch on the gravel. The living room curtains were half closed, leaving just a small gap, and through that narrow space, I watched my 35-year marriage collapse in seconds. Richard was sitting comfortably on the sofa, looking relaxed, not at all like a man who'd spent a long morning at work. Next to him sat Susan, my daughter-in-law, with a stack of papers between them. Those weren't case files or business invoices. I recognized them instantly. Divorce papers. My first reaction was absolute shock. Why was Richard helping Susan draft divorce documents? Was she his client? Then I heard the words that froze me in place. "Are you sure she doesn't suspect anything?" Susan asked, her voice smooth and confident, brushing her golden hair. Hair I once thought made her look so decent. "Linda doesn't suspect a thing," Richard replied coldly. "She's too busy tutoring and babysitting to notice when I leave the house." I gripped the fence just to keep from collapsing. My knees trembled, but the worst was still to come. "Good," Susan said, flipping through the papers. "Then we can move forward with the plan. You'll file for divorce citing irreconcilable differences. Under the new law, I can guarantee you'll keep at least half of all assets." "What about the rental house downtown?" Richard asked. "That one's tricky since it's under her name, but the main house that's key. Even though it's in her name from before the marriage, I can argue that you've contributed money and labor for 35 years. If we get a lenient judge, you could still get a reasonable settlement." I went numb. The house they were talking about, that was the one my mother left me. The home where I lived, taught, raised my son, and watched my granddaughter take her first steps. And now, they were conspiring to steal it from me. "What about the savings account?" my husband continued, his voice like ice. "Given the length of your marriage and shared assets, you're entitled to half. Add the small plot of land and household items, it's a nice chunk. A nice chunk. 35 years of marriage, all the mornings I brewed coffee, washed his shirts, cared for him through illness, cooked dinner every night. Now reduced to 2 careless words. A nice chunk." But what hurt most was Susan's tone, this woman I had once loved, helped through law school, babysat for peas, every weekend, so she and my son could have time together. "Are you sure she won't get suspicious about you visiting more often?" she asked, her voice laced with familiarity that made my skin crawl. "Come on, Susan," Richard said, with a smirk. "Come on. After 35 years, you think I don't know how to handle Linda? She might suspect, but she'll never believe it." That word suspect, it was the bitter farewell to my trust. "And what about Paul?" "And would," she asked, He's at the bank all day and just wants to watch TV at night. If anyone asks, I'll say I'm helping them fix up the house. And just like that, I realized the man I shared a life with and the woman I once called family were quietly rewriting my story without me in it. Fixing up the house? I almost laughed in despair. Right then, they weren't just fixing up a house, they were rebuilding my entire life on paper, using clauses and laws I never imagined would turn against me. Susan stood up and walked toward the window, right where I was standing outside. My heart pounded like a drum. But luckily, she just pulled the curtains shut and didn't look out. I heard the sound of papers being gathered, voices fading, then silence. I walked back to my car, my legs shaking so badly I nearly stumbled. Inside, I turned on my phone, my hands trembling as I hit record, and narrated everything I had just witnessed so I wouldn't forget a single detail. That 15-minute drive back home was the longest 15 minutes of my life. At every stoplight, every turn, their words echoed in my mind. She always suspects, but she never believes. As if 35 years of marriage were just a convenient routine, and I, the wife, the mother, the grandmother, was now merely an obstacle in their plan. When I got home, Richard wasn't back yet. I sat in the kitchen, the same place where we'd shared coffee every morning for over 3 decades, and I cried. Not the kind of crying I did when my mother passed away, but tears mixed with something sharper, anger. A cold, calculated kind of anger, burning slowly but controlled deep inside me. At 64 years old, after a lifetime of being a devoted wife, a caring mother, and a gentle grandmother, I discovered I'd been betrayed, not just by a man, but by a family conspiracy designed to strip me of everything I had. But they had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years teaching rebellious teenagers about rules and consequences. And if I learned anything from 4 decades in the classroom, it's this. When you uncover cheating, the first step is to gather the evidence before taking action. That evening, when Richard came home with his usual excuse, something went wrong at the shop. I smiled and asked how his day had been. He lied straight to my face, with the same calm tone one might use to comment on the weather. And in that moment, I made my decision. If they wanted to play dirty, I would teach them how a seasoned teacher plays to win. The next 3 days were the strangest of my life. I still woke up early, made breakfast as usual, asked Richard about his plans, and quietly watched him lie, gently, smoothly, as if saying, "Looks like rain today. Linda, I have to stay late at the shop today," he said, still using that sweet nickname that once melted my heart but now sounded as fake as a counterfeit coin. "That truck engine's been giving me a headache," he added. A headache? If only he knew the kind of headache I had realizing that my entire marriage had been one long living lie. Maybe then he'd understand real pain. But what hurt most wasn't just the betrayal. It was realizing how blind I had been all those years. I began to notice the little things I used to overlook. The way he combed his hair neatly every morning, even though he worked around. Grease and oil. The new expensive cologne I once thought he wore to boost his confidence after 60. The lunches he used to come home for, but lately skipped claiming he'd stopped for a beer with a client. Beer? Sure, the beer of an affair. That Wednesday, I decided to test it. I called the shop around 3:15 p.m. "Hello, Richard's Auto." It was Jason's voice, the mechanic who'd worked with him for over 10 years. "Hi, Jason. It's Linda. Is Richard there?" "Oh, Mrs. Walker. He left early today. Said he had some personal matters to take care of." "I thought you knew." "Personal matters," I repeated, feeling a chill down my spine. At 3:15 p.m., I grabbed the keys to my small Chevy and drove straight to my son Paul's house. This time, I didn't bother to hide. Richard's silver SUV was still parked under the maple tree, as if it belonged there. I parked across the street and waited. Around 4:30 p.m., the front door opened. First came Susan, glancing up and down the street like someone making sure no one was watching. Then Richard followed, not like a father-in-law visiting his daughter-in-law, but like a man leaving his lover's house. The difference was in the details, the way she straightened his collar, the way she stood in the doorway, smiling and waving until he turned the corner. And most of all, their smiles. The knowing smiles of two people sharing a forbidden secret. My stomach twisted so hard that I had to open the car door to keep from throwing up right there. 35 years of marriage, and I had just found out I'd lost my husband to my own daughter. In law, the mother of my granddaughter, the woman I once helped find a job, the one I invited to Sunday lunch every week. But the worst was yet to come. I waited until Richard left the neighborhood, then drove around the block before coming back. And when I passed by again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Susan was standing by the gate, chatting with Mrs. Clay, the neighborhood gossip. From their body language alone, I knew this wasn't just small talk. I parked 2 houses down, rolled down the window, and pretended to be busy on my phone. She really doesn't suspect anything? Mrs. Clay asked, her tone eager, like she could smell the drama. How could she, Mrs. Clay? Susan replied smugly. Richard says she's so naive, always busy teaching and babysitting she doesn't notice a thing. Naive. I had been too naive, as if 35 years of trust was some kind of character flaw. So, when are you two going to make it official? The neighbor asked, almost drooling with curiosity. Calm down, Susan said with a soft laugh. First, he needs a legal divorce. You know how it is, gotta do everything properly, so he doesn't lose anything in the asset split. Doesn't lose anything. They were talking about my life like it was a failed business deal that just needed to be cleaned up neatly. What about Paul? Mrs. Clay asked. Paul doesn't have a clue, Susan said, her voice dripping with disdain. He thinks his dad's just coming over to help fix up the house. Men are so blind about these things. Blind. Just like his mother, apparently. And what about little Sophie? Won't she think it's strange having her grandpa living here? On the contrary, Susan said, her tone turning cold and calculated. Sophie adores her grandpa Richard. It's actually good, at least she'll have a more present father figure, since Paul's always at work. A more present father figure. They were planning to erase me from my granddaughter's life, to replace me with their idea of a perfect family. One where I never existed. I drove home like I was in a trance, my mind completely adrift. When I got there, I sat at the kitchen table and cried. Cried until there were no tears left to fall. But once the tears dried, something else rose inside me, a coldness I had never felt before. I walked into the bedroom, opened Richard's closet, and started searching. In the pocket of his jeans, I found a crumpled receipt from a small motel downtown. The date, 2 weeks ago. The time, afternoon. The exact day he claimed he was out pricing parts for a client in another city. In the pocket of his shirt, I found something even worse, a shopping list written in Susan's handwriting. But it wasn't for my son Paul's home. It was a list for a new apartment. Curtains, small rugs, queen-size sheets, a coffee maker. They were building their love nest with my money. That evening, when Richard came home with his same tired excuse about issues at the shop, I was ready not to confront him, but to start my own investigation. How was your day, honey? I asked, serving the dinner I'd carefully prepared. Tiring, he said, without even looking at me. That engine just won't get fixed. I smiled. I see. You must have been so busy you didn't even have time for lunch, huh? Yeah, I just grabbed a sandwich. Another lie. Jason at the shop had told me he'd left before lunchtime. Well, I'm glad you got it sorted out, I said, watching every tiny expression on his face. Are you busy again tomorrow? Not sure yet. Depends on the client. Client. How interesting he now referred to my daughter-in-law as a client. After dinner, while he watched TV, I went into the bedroom and called my sister Mary, a retired accountant who lived in Seattle. Mary, I need your help with something, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. What's going on, Linda? There was silence on the other end of the line. Linda, what's going on? I can't explain everything yet, but I need to know how to protect what's mine. Mary, always the practical one, answered right away. First, write everything down: accounts, assets, anything that was in your name before the marriage. Second, open a separate account and don't let him know about it. Third, if you suspect he's withdrawing money, freeze the joint account. Can I really do that? I asked. Of course. Any spouse has the right to request a freeze if there's suspicion of unusual activity. That's your legal protection. Legal protection. Finally, I could see a light at the end of the tunnel. Mary continued. And Linda, if you're asking these questions, it means you've already found something. Stay calm. Don't confront him yet. Gather your evidence first. I hung up, my mind already sketching out a detailed plan. They thought they were dealing with a naive, retired teacher, someone who would sit and cry forever in a dark corner. But they forgot something important. Teachers aren't just educators. We're born investigators. We spend our lives spotting lies, catching kids cheating on tests or trying to fool us. And when we find dishonesty, we know exactly how to handle it. The next morning, when Richard left for another hard day at the shop, I left too. I drove to the local bank, where we had shared an account for over 20 years. Good morning, Mr. Brown. I greeted the branch manager who'd known our family for years. Oh, Mrs. Walker, so good to see you. What can I do for you today? I need to review our joint account. There are a few transactions I'd like to understand better. Over the past 3 months, Richard had withdrawn nearly $6,000 from our joint savings account, always in small amounts to avoid suspicion. $6,000, the money I had earned tutoring English in the evenings, saving every penny for my dream trip to visit my brother in Florida. That $6,000 had now been spent on dates, gifts, and the apartment where they were building their little love nest. At that very moment, the gentle, soft-spoken teacher in me died, and another woman was born. You know the feeling when you're grading papers and realize the student didn't just cheat, but did it badly. That's exactly how I felt as I began investigating my husband's double life. They thought they were clever, but they'd made rookie mistakes. I spent the entire weekend organizing everything, as if preparing a new lesson plan. I pulled out my old leather binder, the one I used to plan my classes, and divided it into sections. Evidence of the affair, financial records, a timeline of events, and an action plan. 40 years in the classroom had given me something they'd never expect: method. On Monday morning, while Richard once again left the house with his usual excuse of being busy at the shop, I started executing my plan. My first stop was the high school, where I still tutored a few afternoons each week. I met Mrs. Rogers, a retired principal, and one of my oldest friends. Rogers, I need your help with something a little strange, I said, sitting down in the familiar teacher's lounge. Go on, Linda. You know I'm always ready to help. I need someone to teach me how to record a conversation on my phone. You know how it is, our generation. Mrs. Rogers looked at me with the knowing eyes of a woman who'd seen much, the eyes of a 67-year-old who understood her friend was quietly planning something serious. Linda, what's happening? I told her everything. Every detail, every discovery, every lie. By the time I finished, her eyes were red with anger. Those bastards! She slammed her hand on the table. 35 years, Linda. How could they be so heartless? That's why I need to learn how to record. If I want to expose a fraud, I need proof. Mrs. Rogers immediately called her granddaughter Julia, 16 years old, who was doing homework in the next room. Julia, come here and show Mrs. Linda how to record a conversation on WhatsApp, sweetie. In just 1 hour, I had become a tech expert. I learned how to record, send files, upload to the cloud everything a grandma detective needed to know. One more thing, Mrs. Linda, Julia said, with the confident tone of youth. If you really want to catch them in the act, you have to act completely natural. Don't change any habits, or they'll get suspicious. I knew I was right to trust the wisdom of the young. I left the school armed and dangerous. Next stop, Paul's house. But this time, it wasn't for spying, it was a grandmotherly visit. Grandma, little Sophie squealed when she saw me at the gate. Did you bring cookies? Of course, sweetheart, I said, handing her the jar of chocolate chip cookies I'd made as my excuse to stop by. Susan appeared in the living room, a flicker of surprise on her face. Oh, hello, Mom. What a surprise. Her voice as sweet as fake sugar. I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd visit my granddaughter, I said, sitting down on the sofa, and maybe have a little chat with you too. I caught a flash of worry in her eyes. What's this about, Mom? Oh, just family things. You've been so busy with work, we hardly ever talk anymore. We chatted casually for about an hour, but I watched every small detail. The way she checked her phone every 5 minutes, the way she tensed when I mentioned Richard, the way she quickly changed the subject when I said he hadn't been spending much time at the shop lately. But what shocked me most came from Sophie, innocent as any, 6-year-old. When she suddenly blurted out, Grandma, why does Grandpa Richard come here when Dad's not home? The room fell silent. Susan's face turned red as a tomato. Oh, sweetheart, she said, struggling to stay calm. He just comes to help Mommy fix things around the house. But why is it always when Dad's not home? The little girl asked, with the brutal honesty only children have. Because that's when he's free, Susan stammered. I smiled at my granddaughter. That's right, Sophie, your grandpa sure has a lot of free time these days. When I left, my heart felt shattered, not just from betrayal, but from realizing they had dragged my innocent granddaughter into their web of lies. A 6-year-old could already sense something was wrong, while the adults thought she didn't understand a thing. That afternoon, I drove downtown and walked into a store I never thought I'd step foot in, a security equipment shop. Hello, I need to buy what do you call it? A small recording device. What do you need it for, ma'am? To record lectures. I lied smoothly. I'm a teacher, and I want to record my lessons for my students to review. I left the store with a digital recorder, about the size of a USB stick, and a sheet of instructions. It cost $200 money I'd earned from weekend tutoring, but worth every penny. When I got home, I practiced using the recorder until I knew it inside out. I tried hiding it in different places in my purse, inside my jacket, even tucked in my sleeve. I was ready for my operation. By Wednesday, the perfect opportunity arrived. Richard said he was going out to give a price estimate for a company at the industrial park, an obvious lie, since he had never worked for any big company. I waited 15 minutes after he left, then called Susan. Hi, Susan. How are you? I'm fine, Mom. Are you busy? I wanted to stop by and talk about Sophie's birthday. I was thinking of throwing her a little party. Her voice hesitated, as if weighing whether it was safe for me to come over. Sure, Mom, you can come. 20 minutes later, I was standing in Paul's living room, the recorder running inside my sleeve, my heart pounding like a drum. Susan greeted me with a forced smile. Have a seat, Mom. Would you like some coffee? Sure, I said, choosing my spot strategically right on the sofa where I had once seen her and Richard plotting together. While Susan went to make the coffee, I whispered into the recorder. At Paul and Susan's house, March 15th, 2 p.m. Here to discuss family matters. Of course, she replied, though her eyes had already turned cautious. Have you noticed Richard acting strange lately? I could almost see the gears turning in her head as she calculated her answer. Strange how? Well, he's been leaving the house more often, coming home late, feeling distant. A woman who's lived with her husband for 35 years can sense those things, right? She took a sip of coffee, clearly buying time to think. Richard's always been devoted to his work. Maybe it's just a rough patch at the shop. Maybe, I nodded. But just between us, you're a lawyer. If a woman my age suspects her husband might be involved with someone else, what should she do? She asked, trying to sound natural but failing miserably. Oh, it's nothing. Just a friend of mine in the neighborhood going through something similar. Her husband's always out, with plenty of excuses. So you think, Richard? I don't know, Susan. Sometimes the wife's the last one to find out. She fell silent. The air in the room was so heavy you could cut it with a knife. May I give some advice? Of course. If it were your friend, I'd tell her not to overthink it. Older men get confused sometimes, but that doesn't mean they're cheating. Maybe it's just a midlife crisis. A midlife crisis at 62? Creative. I'll give her that. You're right, I nodded. But what if the suspicion turns out to be true? What should a wife do then? First, be sure. Don't make a scene based on a hunch. And if it's true, she should consult a lawyer about dividing assets and rights. How does she make sure? I asked, pretending to sound innocent. She gave me a puzzled look. Why are you so interested in this, Mom? Because my friend's really struggling with it. She doesn't know whether to investigate or just let it go. Well, as I always tell my clients, if you're suspicious, it's best to find out. Otherwise, you'll live in torment forever. And if it turns out to be true, then she has to decide. Try to fix the marriage or get a divorce. What about the money part? I asked, hitting the point I needed. Oh, that depends on the assets. If the marriage follows community property rules, the wife is entitled to half of what was acquired after the wedding. But if she has property in her name from before the marriage, the husband can't claim that. Interesting, I said, pretending to be surprised. My friend inherited her house from her mother before she got married. Then she's protected in that regard. But if the house was renovated or upgraded during the marriage, things can get complicated. I recognized that phrase immediately, property improvement. It was the same one I had heard in their earlier conversation. So, if the husband spent money on repairs, even if the house is only in the wife's name, he could still demand compensation? Depends on the case, she replied. But yes, possibly. If there's proof, that's why you need a good lawyer. A good lawyer like her. We talked for another half hour. Every word she said confirmed what I already knew. She was preparing the legal groundwork to take everything from me. Every question I asked for my imaginary friend was answered like a tutorial on how to dismantle a 35-year marriage. When I left Susan's house, I had everything: the recording, proof that she fully understood my assets, and that she was actively plotting to take them. That evening, when Richard came home with the same tired excuse, had to meet a client for a price quote, I was ready for the next step of my plan. How was work today, honey? I asked, setting the dinner table as usual. Rough, he replied. The client wants a price so low, it barely covers the materials. Lies. I knew exactly where he'd been all afternoon. That's too bad, I said, smiling. But sometimes the hard deals work themselves out in the end. The line was silent on the other end. Linda, what's going on? I can't tell you everything yet, but I need to know how to protect what's mine. Mary, always practical, answered at once. First, document everything accounts, property, anything that was in your name before marriage. Second, open a separate account your husband doesn't know about. Third, if you suspect he's withdrawing money, freeze the joint accounts. Can I do that? I asked. Of course. Either spouse can request an account freeze if they suspect unusual transactions. It's a legal protection. Legal protection. At last, I could see a light at the end of the tunnel. Mary continued. And Linda, if you're asking these questions, it means you've discovered something. Be smart. Don't confront them yet. Gather the evidence first. I hung up, and my mind began to map out a detailed plan. They thought they were dealing with a naive retired teacher who would sit and cry in a corner for the rest of her life. But they had forgotten an important thing. Teachers are not only educators, we are natural investigators. We spend our lives spotting when someone lies, cheats on a test, or tries to deceive us. And when we discover fraud, we know exactly how to handle it. The next morning, when Richard left the house for a hard day at the shop, I left too. I went to the local bank where we'd held a joint account for more than 20 years. Good morning, Mr. Brown. I greeted the bank manager who had known our family for years. Oh, Mrs. Linda Walker. Good to see you. How can I help today? I need to discuss our joint account. There are some odd transactions I want to understand. 2 hours later, I walked out with a folder full of statements and a discovery that made my blood boil. Over the past 3 months, Richard had withdrawn nearly $6,000 from our joint savings account, always in small amounts, so it wouldn't draw attention. $6,000 money I had saved from evening English tutoring, penny by penny, for a trip to visit my brother in Florida. Those $6,000 had been spent on dates, gifts, and the apartment they were setting up together. In that moment, the gentle schoolteacher died, and another woman was born. You know that feeling when you're grading papers and realize a student not only cheated but did it badly. That was exactly how I felt when I began to investigate my husband's double life. They thought they were clever, but they made amateur mistakes. I spent the whole weekend organizing everything as if preparing a new lesson plan. I pulled out my old lesson planning satchel and divided it into sections: proof of the affair, financial transactions, a timeline, and an action plan. 40 years in the classroom had given me something they hadn't expected: method. On Monday morning, while Richard left again with the familiar excuse of being busy at the shop, I put my plan into action. First stop, the high school, where I still tutor a few evenings a week. I met Mrs. Rogers, the retired principal, and my longtime friend. Rogers, I need you to help me with something odd, I said, sitting in the familiar teacher's lounge. Tell me, Linda. You know I'm always here for you. I need someone to teach me how to use my phone to record conversations. You know our generation. Mrs. Rogers looked at me with the knowing gaze of a 67-year-old who understood her friend was quietly plotting something serious. Linda, what's happening? And there, I told her everything, every detail, every discovery, every lie. When I finished, Mrs. Rogers's eyes were wet with anger. Those bastards. She slammed her hand on the table. 35 years, Linda. How could they be so heartless? So I need to learn to record. If I'm going to expose a fraud, I need evidence. Mrs. Rogers called her granddaughter Julia, 16, doing homework in the next room. Julia, come here and show Aunt Linda how to record a WhatsApp conversation. In an hour, I was a tech expert. How to record, send files, save to the cloud, everything a little investigating grandma needed. One more thing, Aunt Linda, Julia said with the confident tone of youth. If you really want to catch them in the act, you must act natural. Don't change your routine, or they'll suspect. I trusted the young woman's advice. I left the school armed and dangerous. Next stop, Paul's house. But this time, it was not to spy, it was a proper grandmother's visit. "Grandma!" "Of course, my sweet," I said, handing her the jar of chocolate chip cookies I had deliberately baked as an excuse. "To visit." "Where's your mom?" I asked. Susan appeared in the living room, surprise on her face. "Oh, hi, Mom, what a surprise." Her voice was as sweet as counterfeit candy. "I was just passing by to see my granddaughter," I said, sitting on the sofa, "and thought I'd chat with you for a bit." I saw a flash of worry cross her eyes. "What's wrong, Mom?" "Oh, just family stuff. You're so busy with work we hardly see each other." How she stiffened when I mentioned Richard. How she changed the subject when I said he'd been away from the shop more lately. But what shocked me most was when Sophie, as innocent as any 6-year-old, blurted out, "Grandma, why does Grandpa Richard come here when Daddy isn't home?" The room went quiet. Susan's face flushed red. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Grandpa just comes to help Mom with things around the house." "But why is it always when Daddy's not home?" Sophie pressed, with the blunt logic only a child has. Because he's free then," Susan stammered. I smiled at my granddaughter. "That's right, Sophie, your grandpa has lots of free time." When I left, my heart broke, not just because of the betrayal, but because they had pulled my innocent granddaughter into their web of lies. A 6-year-old had sensed something was wrong, while the grown-ups pretended she understood nothing. That afternoon I went into town and stepped into a shop. I never thought I would enter a security equipment store. "Hi, I need to buy a, what do you call it?" "A small voice recorder." "What will you use it for?" the clerk asked. "I'm a teacher and want to record my lessons for students to review." I left with a digital voice recorder the size of a flash, drive, and an instruction leaflet. It cost $200 money from my weekend tutoring, but worth every cent. At home, I practiced until I was completely confident. I hid the device in different places, my purse, inside my jacket, even up my sleeve. I was ready for the operation. By Wednesday, the opportunity finally came. Richard said he was going out to give a quote for a company in the industrial park, an obvious lie. He'd never worked for any large companies. I waited 15 minutes after he left, and then called Susan. "Hi, Susan, how are you?" "I'm fine, Mom." "Are you busy?" "I want to stop by to talk about Sophie's birthday. I'm planning a small party." Her voice hesitated as she calculated whether it was safe to have me come over. Sure, Mom. Come on over." 20 minutes later, I was at Paul's house, the recorder on inside my sleeve, my heart pounding like a drum. Susan greeted me with a forced smile. "One more thing." Michael smiled. "If they file for divorce first, we'll have a mountain of evidence proving deceit. Judges love that." I left the cafe feeling like a student who had just mastered the hardest lesson of her life. That Saturday, Richard said he had to work half a day at the shop. Of course, he didn't go, but this time, I didn't bother to follow. Instead, I went to see someone I had been avoiding for weeks. Susan was out shopping, or at least that's what Paul believed. "Mom, what a surprise," he said, hugging me tightly. "Hi, son. I need to talk to you about something important. Sophie's at her friend's house." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had interviewed Susan just days earlier. "Paul, I need to tell you something very difficult." He looked at me, worried. "What is it, Mom?" "Healthy, but our family isn't." I told him everything, every discovery, every lie, every piece of the puzzle I had assembled over the past weeks. I showed him photos of receipts, played recordings, and explained the money missing from the savings account. Paul's face turned white as paper. "Mom, are you sure?" "Son, after 40 years in the classroom, I know how to tell truth from lies, and this is the most painful truth I've ever had to face." He buried his face in his hands, his voice trembling. I can't believe Susan and Dad, my own father. How could they? They thought they could keep me in the dark forever. What about Sophie? He asked, his voice breaking. I pulled out the drawing. Mrs. Carter, her teacher, had shown me. They're preparing her to forget me, Paul. Your little girl already senses something is terribly wrong. We both cried right there at the kitchen table. Him, because he realized he was living with a wife who had betrayed the very family that welcomed her. And me, because I saw my son in pain from the greed of those who were supposed to protect him. What are you going to do, Mom? I'm going to protect myself and protect you and Sophie from this nightmare. Do you need my help? I need you to be strong and to trust me. In the next few weeks, a lot will happen. Your wife will try to convince you that I've lost my mind, that I'm making things up. I'll never believe her over you, Paul said firmly. And remember, don't say anything to her yet. Let them think they're still winning. Sunday, the last day of my old life, I hosted a family lunch. I invited everyone: Richard, Paul, Susan, and little Sophie. A farewell dinner, though only I knew its true meaning. I cooked as if it were my last meal. Spaghetti with beef sauce, Southern-style pot roast, and creamy flan. The table was covered with embroidered linen and set with my finest dishes, the ones I only used for special occasions. Throughout the meal, I watched Richard and Susan exchange secret glances. They thought no one noticed. But to me, who knew everything, each gesture was an unspoken confession. The meal is wonderful, mother-in-law, Susan said with a fake smile. Thank you, dear, I replied calmly. This might be the last time I host a meal like this with the whole family together. Everyone froze. Why do you say that, Grandma? Sophie asked. Oh, sweetheart, life changes. You never know what the future holds. Richard cleared his throat, his voice tense. Linda, what are you talking about? Oh, nothing, I said, serving Sophie more dessert. Just thinking how life sometimes brings surprises. Some discoveries can change everything. The table fell silent. A heavy tension filled the room. Paul looked at me, his eyes showing he knew exactly what I meant. Susan grew restless. Richard tried to change the subject. So, Paul, how's work at the bank these days? But I wasn't finished. Do you know what surprises me most in life? I continued. It's how people can pretend for so long. Keeping a lie alive for months, even years, that must be exhausting. Mom? Paul spoke up. Do you want me to help with the dishes? No need, son. Today I want to do everything myself. Tomorrow's Monday, and it's going to be a very different day. When everyone left, I washed the dishes in silence, fully aware this was the last meal of naive Linda. Starting tomorrow, they would meet a version of me even I had never known. Before going to bed, I reviewed all my notes, organized every document Michael would need in the morning, and recorded one last message on my phone. Tomorrow, March 25th, 8 a.m. My fight for justice begins. This isn't revenge. It's a lesson, because some people only learn when they have to pay the price. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow would be the final exam, and I was ready to teach the most important lesson of my career. Monday, 8 a.m. Richard left the house, as usual, kissed me on the cheek, and said he'd be home for lunch. Everything looked the same, except today I knew those habits were about to end. By 8:30, I stood outside the First National Bank with attorney Michael Foster. Mrs. Linda, are you ready? He asked. More than ready, I said, my heartbeat steady and strong. In just 15 minutes, all our joint accounts were frozen, bank cards canceled, Savings locked. From now on, any transaction would require both account holders present with ID. What happens now? I asked. Now, Michael smiled. We wait for their reaction. It'll be interesting. And just as he predicted, not even 2 hours later at 10:15, my phone rang. Richard's voice was frantic. Linda, are you home? Yes. Why? I've been at the bank for an hour and can't withdraw a dime. They said there's a problem with the account. Did you do something? Do something? What do you mean? I asked, feigning innocence. I don't know. Did you sign or change something? No, Richard, I didn't do anything. That's strange. Let me call the bank and ask. Of course I didn't call. Instead, I dialed Michael. He took the bait. He said, now wait for phase 2. He'll call Susan next. Sure enough, by 11 o'clock, the phone rang again. This time, it was Susan. Mother, Richard just called and said you two had some bank trouble. Is there anything I can help with? Oh, that's so thoughtful of you, dear, I said sweetly. Apparently, the account's been frozen. You're a lawyer. I'm sure you know how to handle these things. She was silent for a few seconds, clearly calculating. I can take a look at the papers for you, if you'd like. Wonderful. Can you come over now? Sure. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up, smiling. She was walking right into the trap I'd set. 20 minutes later, Susan was sitting in my living room, wearing that confident face of someone coming to help her clueless mother-in-law. But this time, I was the one in control. So tell me exactly what happened at the bank, she said, all professional charm. Oh, I don't really understand all that, I said, pretending to be confused. Richard said he couldn't withdraw money, and the teller kept talking about locks and paperwork made my head spin. Do you have the bank manager's number? I can call and ask. Yes, I said, pulling out the paper I had already prepared. But before you call, can I ask you something? Of course. As a lawyer, do you think someone might be trying to interfere with our accounts? She stared at me. Why would you think that? Because I suspect someone's been handling my money behind my back, I said, locking eyes with her. She swallowed hard. What makes you think that? Because after 35 years of marriage, a wife knows her husband's habits, and lately, too many things don't add up. Susan began to lose her composure. She was trapped. If she reassured me too much, I'd suspect she knew something. If she agreed, she'd betray her accomplice. Maybe you should just talk to him directly, Mom, she said. Talk to him? I repeated. And if he denies it, how will I know what's true? I picked up the phone and dialed the bank right in front of her. Hello, Mr. Brown. This is Linda. I'm here with my daughter-in-law, who's a lawyer, and we'd like to understand what's going on with our account. Mrs. Linda, Mr. Brown's. The voice came through clearly. As I told Mr. Richard, the account was temporarily frozen due to suspicious activity. Suspicious activity? I repeated loudly so Susan could hear. Yes, a pattern of frequent small withdrawals and attempts to transfer funds to a third-party account that one of the account holders was unaware of. Susan's face turned pale. And who requested this freeze? I asked, keeping my eyes locked on her. The freeze was requested by you, ma'am, through your authorized legal representative. Mr. Brown's steady voice came over the phone. Ah, that's right, I said, pretending to suddenly remember. I completely forgot that would be attorney Michael Foster. I hung up and looked at Susan with an innocent smile. My memory's been terrible lately. I even forgot I'd hired a lawyer to handle my finances. You hired a lawyer? She stammered. Of course, I replied gently. A friend from Seattle recommended him. She said he's excellent with, What do they call it? Oh, yes, fraudulent marriage cases. The room went silent. Susan froze. She'd just realized that her prey not only knew everything but was legally armed. Why, why would you do that? She asked, trying to steady her voice. Do what, dear? Hire a lawyer without telling the family. It's time, I said, standing up and walking to the cabinet where I kept my teaching materials. I returned with a brown leather folder in hand. Susan, I said, opening it. After 40 years of teaching, I've learned one thing. Pretending not to see cheating never helps anyone. I pulled out the highlighted bank statements. $6,000, Susan. $6,000 withdrawn gradually over 3 months from my savings account. She opened her mouth to speak, but I continued. And here, I said, laying down more papers, motel receipts downtown, gift shop purchases, even a due lease for an apartment, all paid for with the money I earned from weekend tutoring. How did you? She stuttered. I can explain. Really? I cut her off, taking a small recorder from the folder. Then explain this. I pressed play. Her own voice filled the room. Given the length of the marriage and community property laws, you're entitled to half of everything purchased after the wedding. Susan went white as a sheet. And this, I said, playing another clip. Even if the house is in her name from before marriage, I can argue that joint investments were made in repairs and renovations over 35 years. She shot up from her chair, but I wasn't done. And finally, I said, pulling out Sophie's drawing. Explain why my 6-year-old granddaughter has already been prepared to forget me. When she saw the picture, she collapsed, sobbing, but those weren't tears of remorse, only the tears of someone caught red-handed. How did you find out? She cried. Susan, I've spent 40 years spotting when a student lies. Did you really think a 62-year-old man and a 30-year-old lawyer could outsmart me? Just then, the front door burst open. Richard stormed in, face red, voice booming from the doorway. Linda, what is this? What's this about a lawyer? He charged in like a storm, then froze when he saw Susan crying and me sitting calmly at the table, every document laid out in perfect order. Sit down, Richard, I said with a calmness that even surprised me. We need to talk. Talk about what? What kind of crazy stunt is this? Why did you freeze the accounts? Crazy. I stood, looking straight at the man I'd shared 35 years with. Crazy as finding out your husband's been stealing to feed his mistress. Those words hit the room like a bomb. Richard froze for a few seconds, then reacted instinctively. Mistress? You've lost your mind, Linda. Lost my mind? I repeated. Losing your mind is when a woman works for 35 years, builds everything she owns, and then finds out her husband is handing it all to his daughter-in-law. I picked up the recorder and played the first clip I had captured of them. As soon as the old lady signs, everything we want will be ours. Susan's voice echoed through the device. Silence filled the room. Then I played another recording. Linda doesn't suspect a thing. Then came the neighbor's voice. Really, Susan? Yeah. Richard says she's so naive. The evidence was undeniable, and now it all resounded between the 4 walls of the suburban house they had tried to steal from me. Richard collapsed onto the sofa, his breathing uneven. Linda, he started, but I cut him off. No. Now it's my turn to speak. You two had months to manipulate and deceive. Now you'll listen carefully. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden where I had planted every rose bush and lavender sprig with my own hands. 35 years, Richard. 35 years of waking up early to make your coffee, washing your clothes, caring for you when you were sick. And this is how you repay me? By conspiring to steal everything my son and I built? That's not stealing. Susan tried to speak. It's stealing because both of you know this house was my mother's inheritance, and the savings came from my decades of teaching, yet you schemed to take it all under a legal disguise. I turned to face her. The worst part is that you took advantage of my trust. I treated you like a daughter, helped your career, cared for your child with all my love. Mother-in-law, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm not your mother-in-law anymore, I interrupted. A mother-in-law has a daughter-in-law. All I have is a venomous snake who deceived me for months. Then I turned to Richard, my voice trembling but firm. You were my partner, the father of my son, the grandfather of my granddaughter, and you traded all that for an affair with a woman 32 years younger than you? He opened his mouth to protest, but I didn't let him. Do you know what hurts the most? Not the betrayal, the coldness. You and she sat in this very room, plotting every step to destroy me while I poured you both coffee, thinking I was caring for my family. I pulled a document from my folder, but you both made a big mistake, I said, my voice calm but chilling. I handed over the first paper. Formal complaint to the National Bar Association regarding attorney Susan Johnson's conduct, using client information for personal gain, violating professional confidentiality, and attempting to defraud a vulnerable individual. Susan went pale as paper. This will destroy my career, she whispered. You should have thought of that sooner, I replied coldly. Actions have consequences. That's the first lesson we teach children. Richard finally spoke. Linda, can we talk? Let's settle this privately as a family. Family? I laughed bitterly. Which family? Richard, the one you're trying to destroy, or the new one you're building with my daughter-in-law? But now you have two choices. One, sign the divorce papers, keep what's truly yours, and leave this house peacefully. Or two, we go to court, and you'll lose everything, even your reputation, charged with fraud. The room fell into heavy silence. And if I sign? Richard asked, his voice breaking. Then you pack your things and leave today. Keep your repair shop, keep your car. But this house, the savings, the furniture, all of it belongs to me. I gave a bitter smile. Isn't that what you wanted anyway? Dividing assets, wasn't it? Susan stood up, trembling. I'm leaving. I can't breathe in here. Fine, I said. But before you go, you'll call Paul and tell him everything, the affair, the plan, the lies. My son deserves to know who the real mother of his child is. I won't do it, she said quietly. You will, came a calm but firm voice from the doorway. It was attorney Michael Foster. I had left the door open for him. If you don't, we'll submit all this evidence to court. And trust me, the judge won't be as merciful as Mrs. Linda. Susan looked at Richard, silently pleading for rescue, but he only lowered his head, saying nothing, utterly defeated. Fine, she said, her voice breaking. I'll call Paul. Right in front of me. She dialed my son's number and confessed everything. The affair with Richard, the plan to take my assets, the months of deceit. I could hear my son sobbing on the other end, and my heart shattered for him. When she hung up, attorney Michael handed a stack of papers to Richard. 3 copies, he said. An uncontested divorce agreement, a renunciation of all claims to the house, and a restraining clause preventing any contact with Mrs. Linda except in matters regarding Sophie. Richard signed without reading a single page. An hour later, they both left my house. Susan stormed off, honking her car horn like a spoiled child. Richard carried a small suitcase and glanced back at me once before driving away. I stood in the living room surrounded by papers, recordings, and evidence. The house was silent, but it was no longer emptiness. It was freedom. 2 hours later, Paul arrived with Sophie. His eyes were red as he hugged me tightly. Mom, I'm so sorry. There's nothing to forgive, son. You were a victim too. What will you do now? Start over, I said, lifting Sophie into my arms. The three of us just as it was always meant to be. 6 months later, Paul and Sophie moved in with me. He transferred to a local bank branch nearby. Sophie began therapy and slowly became her cheerful little self again, filling her drawings with smiles. Susan lost her law license for several years and left town. Richard sold his repair shop and moved to Portland. I heard he's trying to start over. As for me, I opened a small tutoring class right here at home. The old living room became a cozy study space. Every afternoon, students came for lessons, and Sophie helped serve water and cookies to Grandma's students. I never remarried, nor did I want to. At 64, I've learned I can be happy on my own. People sometimes ask if I still hate Richard. Honestly, no. I just feel pity. He traded 35 years of real life for a few months of illusion, and now he's alone, old, and without a family. As for me, I live strong, peaceful, surrounded by genuine love. Life has taught me this. Don't waste your energy hating those who betrayed you. Use it to rebuild your own life. And that's exactly what I'm doing. One day, Sophie asked, "Grandma, are you sad? Grandpa doesn't live here anymore?" I smiled. "No, sweetheart. I'm happy because now this house is filled only with people who truly love one another." This story is fictional but inspired by real-life events, with names and places changed to protect privacy. Linda endured one of the deepest betrayals of her life, not just from her husband, but from the daughter-in-law she once loved like her own. But instead of seeking revenge through bitterness, she chose to speak up, stand tall, and defend her dignity. Sometimes in life, when we're deeply hurt, we must ask ourselves, is silence truly forgiveness, or just permission for others to keep doing wrong? Linda chose action, and God granted her the peace that comes from doing what's right. May each of us find the strength to live honestly, love sincerely, and be loved the way we deserve. May God bless you. And don't forget to watch the 2 videos suggested at the end of the screen. Perhaps another story there will touch your heart today.